I still remember the exact moment I decided to go on this trip, even though dread tugged at me every step of the way. It was Naomi who first suggested we head deep into the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, far out in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, for a weekend camping excursion. She had discovered some old travel guide that claimed there were spectacular overlooks and hidden trails that almost no one knew about. When she brought it up, I hesitated. I was never one for remote places, especially not ones rumored to be haunted by restless spirits of the Civil War era or older colonial ghosts and witches. But Naomi always had a way of wearing you down with her enthusiasm. Plus, part of me wanted to push past the anxieties I'd struggled with for years. I told myself it would be fine, that everything could be explained logically, and that maybe I'd come back with some interesting stories. None of us had any idea how those stories would become nightmares etched permanently into our minds. It ended up being 5 of us. Me, Jordan Samuels, plus Naomi Blake, Elliot Carter, who we always called Eli, Mercedes Lou, and Wesley James. I guess if I had to label our group dynamic, I'd say Naomi was the spark, the one who pushed for exciting new experiences. She had that bold streak, always the first to volunteer for the scary part of a haunted house, always the one urging the rest of us to live a little. Eli was our resident skeptic. He was practical to a fault, eternally convinced that if we heard an unexplained noise in the woods, we'd discover a perfectly rational explanation. Then there was Mercedes, who had a fascination with folklore and ghost stories. She was always reading up on local legends, especially ones from the region's colonial history. Wesley was the physically capable one, the type who spent weekends rock climbing or backpacking. He was also an adrenaline junkie, never happier than when stepping off the beaten path into some wilderness. And me? Well, I've never been all that brave. I've got more curiosity than is good for me, an overactive imagination that seldom let me get a good night's sleep, and a love for books that kept me indoors more often than I like to admit. The plan was simple enough on paper. We'd drive out early on Friday, set up camp near a remote trail that was supposedly near an old Civil War encampment, spend a couple of nights beneath the stars, and explore some hidden corners of the forest. Naomi had pinned a spot on a digital map, though she admitted it was guesswork, since the place didn't have an official campground listing. She was convinced we'd find a perfect clearing near a small stream, just a short hike off the main trailhead. Wesley, who prided himself on navigation, brought along a trusty old compass as well as a modern GPS device, just in case. I remember sitting in the back seat of the car, watching the forests roll by as the highways turned into winding back roads, my stomach twisting with both excitement and an indefinable tension. Even though I was determined to enjoy this trip, I felt a strange sense of foreboding, as if the old trees and silent hills we passed were sizing us up somehow. When we arrived at the edge of the forest, it was late afternoon. The air felt strangely cold for that time of year. Naomi hopped out first, stretching her legs and breathing in the crisp air as if it were an elixir. Eli was busy fiddling with the trunk, pulling out tents and gear. Mercedes cast her gaze around, remarking how there was something in the atmosphere here, something she couldn't quite articulate. Wesley studied his compass and the map on his phone. For a moment he said something was off, like the phone's GPS kept flickering, refusing to pinpoint our location with total accuracy. But he shrugged it off, explaining that mountain ranges sometimes interfered with the signals. We loaded up our backpacks and set off down what passed for a path, though calling it a trail would be generous. We hiked for about an hour before deciding on a campsite near what seemed like an old stone foundation overgrown with moss. None of us could quite identify what the structure had been, maybe a shed or an abandoned barn from a bygone era. The trees were thick, their branches twisting overhead in a dense canopy that let in minimal sunlight. What little light filtered down gave the ground a mottled pattern of dark and golden shapes. We were all sweating by the time we set our packs down, but the wind that blew through every so often felt unnervingly cold against my skin. It was as though the forest breathed in a cycle, exhaling chilling gusts that rustled the leaves. Still, the spot had its own rugged charm. The old foundation provided a sense of history, which Mercedes found captivating. She liked to run her fingertips over the stones, musing about the stories they might tell if only they could speak. We got to work pitching our tents and arranging a small fire ring with stones. Naomi and Wesley did most of the heavy lifting, while I tried to keep my mind off every rustling in the nearby undergrowth. Eli was sorting out kindling, joking about how he'd read a study that said the most common reason people get spooked in the dark is just misinterpretations of natural sounds. He did it to calm my nerves, I think, but it also made me self-conscious. After we had settled in, we shared a quick meal of canned beans, granola bars, and some fresh fruit we'd packed. The plan was to scout around the area tomorrow, maybe follow the faint path to see if there were any vantage points or streams. Naomi wanted to find a scenic overlook she swore was in the area, though she admitted her sources were vague. I tried to keep my mind focused on the adventure aspect, but a heaviness in my gut told me we might have been better off at a standard campground with ranger stations and other people around. Night fell with a suddenness that caught me off guard. The sky went from dusky orange to deep indigo, and the temperature dropped sharply. We huddled around the fire, telling jokes and half-hearted ghost stories. Mercedes regaled us with bits and pieces of local lore, stories she'd found in some dusty corner of the internet, old tales of witches living deep in the Virginia woods, rumored sightings of Civil War soldiers seen wandering at twilight, and cryptic references to bizarre creatures that roamed the Blue Ridge after dark. Eli rolled his eyes for most of it, chiming in occasionally to say, "It's just environment plus imagination," or something dismissive. Wesley would laugh, but I could see him glancing over his shoulder as the wind caused a branch to snap somewhere out in the darkness. Naomi looked enthralled. She was always drawn to the mysterious and the dangerous. As for me, my heart pounded every time a log in the fire popped too loudly. A little later, we noticed the wind picking up. It had a strange quality, almost like it was circling our campsite. The embers of the fire would blow one way, then another, and sparks would drift off in changing directions. The trees creaked, and occasionally I could have sworn I heard a faint voice in the breeze. At first I chalked it up to the way wind can whistle through branches, but there was a cadence to it, almost like laughter. I tried to steady my nerves, telling myself it was just the wind and my overactive brain. But then Naomi sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked. Nobody answered right away, but Mercedes nodded hesitantly, confirming that she'd also heard something that sounded like a giggle. Eli just scoffed, but I noticed the set of his jaw tightened. That night, I barely slept. I was in my tent, listening to every tiny noise, the rustle of leaves, the soft hooting of an owl, the distant scurrying of some small creature in the undergrowth. My mind kept replaying Mercedes's legends of witches who once performed strange rites in these forests, and the old Civil War battles that left thousands of unmarked graves scattered beneath the soil. I drifted off near midnight, only to jerk awake to the sound of what I thought was heavy breathing outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering so fiercely I thought it would tear through my chest. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The breathing faded, replaced by a sudden gust of wind. Maybe it was just the wind in the pines, I thought. Eventually, I fell back asleep from sheer exhaustion. Morning arrived with a cool gray light filtering through the canopy. We roused ourselves slowly. Naomi was the first to unzip her tent and step out. She announced that she'd found footprints in the mud near where we'd set the fire. I crawled out, sore from sleeping on rocky ground, and joined her. Sure enough, there were tracks, elongated impressions that looked vaguely humanoid but not quite right. Eli insisted they were some sort of distorted animal prints, shaped by the irregular mud. Naomi disagreed, pointing out that the prints almost looked like a person walking on the balls of their feet, but with claws or something scraping at the edges. My stomach churned at the thought. Mercedes took pictures with her phone. Wesley looked uneasy, but tried to frame it as a puzzle. Maybe a raccoon with an injured paw, he suggested, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. We decided to take a short hike after breakfast. The forest looked different in daylight, still dense and imposing, but at least more manageable without the darkness. We tried to follow the faint trail that led deeper into the woods, passing by the mossy foundation that had initially caught our eye. Up close, I noticed it had odd markings on one side, like old carved letters worn away by time. We couldn't decipher them, but Mercedes snapped more photos for reference. We pressed on, the path taking us through a series of gentle slopes, carpeted with fallen leaves and pine needles. Every so often, Wesley would pause to check his compass, frowning when it appeared to spin slightly before settling. His GPS device also lost signal intermittently, which he attributed to the steep ridges. At one point, we reached a small clearing that gave us a partial view of the forested hills in the distance. The wind blew steadily, sending leaves swirling in a mini whirlwind around my ankles. That was when I spotted something moving at the edge of the clearing, maybe 200 feet away. It was just a flash, a pale shape ducking behind the trunk of a broad oak tree. Before I could say anything, it was gone, and I wasn't sure if I had really seen it or if it was just my eyes playing tricks. I glanced at Naomi, whose eyes were wide. She opened her mouth to speak, then clamped it shut, seemingly unsure. I decided not to mention it. We eventually circled back to our campsite, slightly unnerved but unwilling to discuss it openly. That afternoon, we busied ourselves reinforcing our tents and gathering more firewood. Eli, determined to rationalize everything, lectured us on how the environment could cause illusions. Between the wind, the light, and the stress of being out here, it's easy to see things, he said. I tried to believe him. Meanwhile, Mercedes wanted to explore more of the old landmarks. She kept mentioning she'd read about witches or medicine women who used to operate in these mountains, mixing native traditions with colonial folk magic. It's part of the region's tapestry, she'd say, breathless with excitement. The conflict between her fascination and our creeping fear created a tense undercurrent among us. Dusk settled faster than any of us expected, and we huddled around the fire once more for dinner. The conversation was subdued. We ate mostly in silence until Naomi ventured the idea that maybe we should consider leaving in the morning, if we still felt uneasy. Wesley objected, saying we'd only just arrived and that we should at least see if we could find that rumored overlook. Eli stayed quiet, which was unusual for him, while Mercedes kept glancing into the forest as if drawn by an unseen presence. I hovered somewhere between relief at the thought of leaving and a stubborn curiosity that wanted answers. As the fire crackled, darkness settled in around us, forming a wall that our flashlights barely penetrated. We talked in low voices, discussing the plan for the night. Eventually, we decided to keep watch in shifts, half joking that if there really was something out there, we'd catch it. Deep down, I think we all wanted reassurance. Naomi volunteered for the first shift. I was exhausted but promised I'd take the second. The others arranged their sleeping bags, and soon enough, the campsite grew quiet, except for the occasional pop of the fire and the steady crackle of burning wood. I fell asleep quickly, worn out from the day's exertions. Sometime later, I jerked awake to the sound of Naomi's voice. She was hissing my name, urgent and afraid. I unzipped my tent and scrambled out into the cold night air, nearly tripping over the edge of the fire ring. Naomi was standing there with a flashlight, pointing it toward the edge of the trees. "Look," she whispered. I followed her trembling finger. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness and the twisted shapes of branches. Then I caught a flicker of movement, like a silhouette shifting between the trunks. It moved in a way that defied logic. One moment it was tall and rigid, the next it seemed to scuttle close to the ground. Naomi handed me the flashlight, motioning for me to shine it into the woods. When I did, the beam revealed a gaunt figure, pale skin stretched tight over bones, eyes glinting in the light like an animal's. It was near the perimeter of our camp, maybe 40 or 50 feet away. My heart thundered in my chest, and I struggled to breathe. The figure's face was partially concealed by a tattered cloth, or maybe it was just so sunken that it looked like a hood of skin draped over bone. It made no sound, except for what might have been raspy breathing, or maybe that was the wind. Naomi and I stood there petrified, and for the span of a few heartbeats the creature remained still, as if studying us with a terrible curiosity. Then, with a sudden lurching motion, it disappeared behind a tree. Naomi and I both screamed, and that woke the others in an instant. Everyone tumbled out of their tents, disoriented by our shouts and the chaotic flicker of flashlight beams. Wesley grabbed a larger flashlight, scanning the tree line. We saw no sign of the creature, just the silent gloom of the forest. Eli, furious at being startled awake, insisted it must have been a deer, or maybe just a trick of the light. "I saw it," Naomi insisted, her voice shaking. Jordan saw it too. Mercedes, eyes wide, asked if it looked human. I could hardly describe it in words. I just shook my head, trying to convey how wrong its shape was, how unnatural it felt. The shock of it left me trembling head to toe. We spent the next hour huddled together near the fire, each of us scanning the darkness with our flashlights, jumping at every sound. Eventually, Wesley suggested we gather more wood and keep the fire roaring through the night. Nobody argued. Even Eli, who was usually the first to demand rationality, wasn't mocking us anymore. I think the fear in our voices sobered him. Once we had enough firewood to last until dawn, we arranged ourselves in a rough circle, backs facing in, watching the perimeter. The hours dragged on. The wind howled, leaves rustled, and occasionally we heard that eerie echo of laughter carried on the gusts. It could have been an animal or the wind itself, but after seeing that figure, we couldn't be sure. At some point, maybe around 3 or 4 in the morning, I started nodding off. My eyes were sore from staring into the darkness. Suddenly, a sound startled me awake, a faint scraping, like claws on wood. My heart jumped into my throat. The others heard it too. We aimed our flashlights in the direction of the old mossy foundation, just a few yards away from our tents. For a split second, I saw what looked like a pale hand gripping the edge of the ancient stone, fingernails cracked and dirty, before it slithered out of sight. Naomi gasped, and Wesley whispered a string of curses. The next moments were chaotic. We stumbled forward, shining our lights around, but the figure was gone. The only traces were strange scratch marks on the moss-covered rocks, marking them in a pattern that looked almost like desperate clawing. We didn't sleep after that. We huddled together until the sky began to lighten, minds racing with what to do next. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on our eyelids, but fear kept us jittery. Naomi broke the silence, suggesting we pack up and leave this place. Eli, to my surprise, didn't argue. He was pale and withdrawn, his skepticism rattled by the fact that so many of us had seen the same horrifying form. Mercedes looked torn. She whispered something about wanting to understand what we encountered, that maybe it was some manifestation of the land's violent past, but her voice shook with terror. Wesley put his hand on her shoulder, shaking his head. "It's not worth it," he said quietly. "We don't know what we're dealing with." We began breaking down camp as the sun rose. The wan light revealed the site in all its forlorn detail. The foundation with fresh scratches, the muddy area where the elongated footprints from yesterday had multiplied. We found more of them scattered around, as though the creature had circled our tents repeatedly during the night. The realization that it might have been watching us for hours made me feel sick. I wanted nothing more than to escape, to see highways and gas stations and crowds of people. Yet a part of me felt a pull, a macabre fascination with the question of what lurked here. But that curiosity was overshadowed by raw fear and the sense that we were trespassers in a place that wanted us gone. Once we'd stowed our gear, we started our trek back. The path we'd taken now seemed confusing. Twice we had to backtrack because the trail seemed to vanish under fallen branches or thick undergrowth. Wesley tried to navigate with his compass, but it spun erratically at times, as if magnetized to something beneath the earth. Eli struggled with the GPS, which again showed erratic readings. Hours crawled by. The deeper we went, the more certain I felt that we were being watched. The trees pressed in on us, their twisted branches forming shapes that seemed to reach for us. Occasionally we caught glimpses of something moving in the corner of our vision, a pale figure flitting between shadows. Each time we aimed our flashlights or turned our heads, nothing was there. Our nerves were frayed. We bickered over which direction to go, losing precious time as midday turned to late afternoon. The fear that we'd be caught out here for another night weighed heavily on everyone. Naomi's earlier boldness was nearly gone, replaced by a haunted look in her eyes. She kept glancing behind her as if expecting the creature to pounce. Mercedes recounted old stories she had read, her voice trembling. She mentioned how certain sightings described a being that was part soldier's ghost, part vengeful spirit of the land, something that fed on the pain and suffering etched into the soil by centuries of conflict and tragedy. The wind whipped around us, as if to punctuate her words with a grim exclamation. Finally, we spotted a more defined trail that looked like it had been used recently. Relief washed over us like a tidal wave. We followed it, hearts pounding, practically jogging despite the weight of our backpacks. The trees began to thin out, and I spotted the hint of a larger path beyond the ridge. In that moment, I dared to hope we'd make it out of this nightmare unscathed. But just before we emerged onto the broader trail, the wind kicked up violently. It roared through the trees, sending branches snapping. A dead pine crashed to the ground not 50 feet from us, blocking our path. Then came the laughter, unmistakable now, childlike, high-pitched, echoing around us in a cruel mockery. My blood ran cold. We frantically changed direction, scrambling around the fallen tree, hearts pounding. That was when we saw it again, perched on a boulder on the hillside, looking down at us like some grotesque sentinel. The same gaunt form, elongated limbs, tattered rags of something that might have been clothing centuries ago. It didn't move, just watched as we scurried away. Eli shouted something unintelligible, maybe a curse or a demand for the creature to leave us alone, but there was no reply. I swear I saw it tilt its head in a way that almost conveyed amusement. Then the wind gusted again, and it vanished behind a gnarled oak. We didn't linger to see if it would reappear. We bolted, half running, half stumbling, until we found ourselves on a wider trail that looked like it led back toward a logging road or a service road. The sky was darkening, streaked with the orange glow of the setting sun. We pushed onward for another hour, ignoring the burn in our calves and the dryness in our throats, spurred on by the sense that if we stopped for even a moment, we'd feel those eyes on us again. Finally, we found a gravel road leading back to where we'd parked. Our vehicles were still there, an oasis of safety in an otherwise forsaken landscape. By then, night was almost upon us, and the distant call of some nocturnal animal made me jump. We threw our gear in the trunk as fast as we could, none of us speaking. The drive out was tense and silent. Occasionally, someone would glance out the window at the endless trees, half expecting that pale face to be peering out at us from the undergrowth. But we saw no more signs of it. The turning roads eventually gave way to a main highway, and streetlights appeared like beacons of deliverance. Only once we were well away from that place did anyone speak. Naomi murmured an apology for suggesting the trip, tears in her eyes. Eli stared straight ahead at the road, knuckles white on the steering wheel. Mercedes clutched her phone, scanning through the pictures she'd taken. She kept shaking her head, saying none of them showed anything definitive. Wesley just stared at his compass, tapping it fruitlessly in frustration. When we reached a motel off the interstate, we decided to spend the night there rather than drive straight home in our shaken condition. We took 2 rooms. In the stale brightness of the motel lobby, everything felt surreal. I caught sight of my reflection in a hallway mirror. I looked pale, eyes ringed with dark circles, like I hadn't slept in days. We piled into the rooms, sat on the beds, and tried to make sense of what happened. Eli was quieter than I'd ever seen him. He finally admitted that he couldn't dismiss what we all witnessed, that it defied his usual explanations. Mercedes tried to look through her phone once more, swearing she remembered hearing about a local legend that specifically matched what we saw. "It's like the spirit of every tragedy in those mountains," she said, voice trembling. "Soldiers, children, colonists, maybe even older spirits, all twisted into one form." Wesley insisted we never speak of it again. "No good can come of digging into this," he muttered. The night in the motel was restless. I couldn't stop imagining that figure perched outside the window, just waiting for us to let our guard down. I had nightmares that made me bolt upright, shaking. The next morning we piled into our cars and headed for home without much discussion. Everyone was subdued, the radio off, the only noise the hum of the engine and the low buzz of the air conditioning. Whenever we passed a wooded area, my heart rate shot up. I noticed Naomi biting her nails, something she never did before. Eli was breathing hard, gripping the steering wheel, as if expecting something to jump out onto the road. Eventually, I made it back to my small apartment. The others went to their respective homes, promising we'd meet up or call each other soon, though we never set a date. I collapsed onto my bed, letting the familiarity of my 4 walls surround me. Yet the comfort was shallow. I couldn't get that image out of my mind. The pale creature with sunken eyes, the sense that it was as old as the land itself, carrying the echoes of centuries of sorrow and anger. In the days that followed, I found myself avoiding phone calls from well-meaning friends who hadn't been on the trip. I didn't want to answer questions about how my camping adventure went. I think the others felt similarly because we all sort of drifted into our own private corners, trying to cope with what we'd experienced. Naomi eventually reached out to me via text, saying she'd been having nightmares and felt guilty for insisting on such a remote spot. I assured her it wasn't her fault, that none of us could have known. She confessed that a part of her still wondered if the forest was cursed somehow, if we'd stumbled onto something that should have remained undisturbed. I wanted to console her, to say it was all just some elaborate series of coincidences, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Eli, for his part, wrote a detailed list of everything that happened, trying to make sense of it logically. He sent me an email with bullet points, time of the first sighting, weather conditions, the odd footprints. His final note just said, "I still can't explain it," which for someone like Eli was a profound admission. Mercedes told me she'd tried to do more research online about the area. She found references to rumored sightings of a pale sentinel going back decades, but nothing concrete, just blog posts and ephemeral stories. She also reached out to local historians, but most wouldn't take her seriously. One person told her the Blue Ridge region was full of ghost tales, cautionary legends about everything from witches to ghouls. That person also suggested that some tragedies leave an imprint on the land. People see shapes or figures that represent the collective trauma, but that was just speculation. Mercedes felt it was more than that, and so did I. In the end, we never got a firm answer about what we encountered. I suspect it was something beyond a simple ghost story or an urban legend, something older and darker. Though I don't have proof, I believe it was tied to the land's history. Wars, violence, unmarked graves, stolen territory, maybe even older indigenous curses long forgotten. All of that seemed to have coalesced into a malevolent presence that fed on fear and despair. It haunted those woods, and we were unfortunate enough to wander into its domain. Whether it was a single entity or many spirits acting as one, I couldn't say. But the memory of it, the way it stood there with that awful curiosity, is burned into my mind forever. Weeks passed, and the five of us eventually met up at a diner in town. We exchanged awkward hugs, each of us scanning the other's face for signs of how they were coping. Conversation was stilted at first, but then Naomi broke the tension by apologizing once more. Wesley told her to stop apologizing. It was done, and we survived. "We have to move on," he said firmly. Eli nodded, adding, "Trying to figure it all out might drive us crazy." Mercedes was the only one who seemed conflicted, a part of her still yearning to piece together the puzzle. I could see the haunted gleam in her eye, that need for closure. I knew the feeling, but none of us wanted to set foot in those woods again. We agreed we wouldn't talk about this outside our small circle. We made half-hearted jokes about not wanting to be labeled as crackpots. But I think the real reason was that talking about it made the fear too real, kept it alive. Sometimes the best you can do with a horror like that is to compartmentalize it. Let it become a fragment of your past that you store away. When we parted ways that night, I could tell we were all different. Our bond was stronger in some ways, but fragile in others. We shared a secret that no one else would believe, one that filled our dreams with shadows and made us jump at the sound of wind in the trees. Months later, I tried to go camping again, just to prove to myself I could. It was a completely different place, a well-maintained state park with rangers and lit trails. I remember setting up my small tent and feeling a chill at the sight of the moon through the pines. For a split second, I imagined a gaunt shape standing at the edge of the clearing. My heart thundered, but when I blinked, there was nothing there. I never fully relaxed that night, but I made it through without incident. It was almost a year after that when I dared to venture into the wilderness again, this time on a group trip with other friends who had never heard my story. Even then, every snap of a branch made my nerves flare. On restless nights, my mind still drifts back to those moments in the Blue Ridge, to the echo of that laughter and the fleeting glimpses of a pale figure. I wonder if it's still out there, skulking around the old foundation, trailing unsuspecting hikers in the dusk hours. Maybe it's waiting for the next band of curious souls to wander off marked trails. It's not just the memory of seeing it that gets to me, but the sense of ancient sorrow and fury that radiated from it. It was as though the entire forest was alive with old wounds, illusions left by centuries of strife, and we stumbled right into the heart of it. Sometimes I think about the footprints, the scratch marks on the stone, the way my flashlight illuminated that skeletal face for one heart-stopping instant. If I close my eyes, I can still see it, angled in that inquisitive tilt, as though marveling at us or mocking us. I recall the final glimpse on the boulder, the hush that fell over the woods, as if everything was paying attention to that one moment. In that hush, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the chill of realizing just how small and insignificant we are in the face of forces we can't comprehend. I've come to terms with the fact that some experiences remain unexplained. We can't always wrap them up neatly with scientific facts or comforting folklore. This was something that felt raw and primal, a convergence of historical pain and something altogether otherworldly. If someone were to ask me for details, I'd tell them the same story, though I'd leave out the parts that keep me awake at night. I'd probably mention the footprints and the swirling compass, the illusions of laughter in the wind, but I'm not sure I'd be able to articulate the overwhelming sense of being in the presence of a malicious intelligence, something that didn't just passively exist, but actively relished our fear. Every now and then I reach out to Naomi or Mercedes, just to touch base, to confirm we're all doing okay. Naomi has gotten into photography. She focuses on cityscapes now, never venturing into remote landscapes. She told me once that she tried to photograph a deserted property on the outskirts of town at sunset, but she felt a paralyzing anxiety and left after just a few minutes. Mercedes has channeled her fascination into writing, short stories and articles about Virginia's haunted history. She asked if I minded her fictionalizing elements of our encounter for a piece she was working on. I told her it was fine, as long as she changed the names. She said she did, but she left the essence of the horror intact. Eli, on the other hand, rarely talks about it. He's immersed himself in work, burying his memories beneath stacks of spreadsheets and data. Wesley goes on day hikes but doesn't camp overnight anymore, at least not in remote areas. He told me he's lost that taste for extreme backwoods adventure. As for me, I still live in Virginia, though I keep a respectful distance from the Blue Ridge region where it all happened. Sometimes, out of some twisted sense of curiosity, I'll read about other people's experiences in the area, scanning for any mention of a pale figure or strange footprints. There are a few forum posts out there, each telling a vague story of unexplained sightings or bizarre echoes in the night. I wonder if it's the same entity, or if there are more spirits out there, drifting through these ancient forests. The land is old after all, and it has seen so much bloodshed and pain. Who knows what else lingers in the shadows? I still wake up sometimes with the echo of that childlike laughter ringing in my ears. In those moments I sit up, heart pounding, half expecting to see that gaunt face peering at me through the window. But I'm safe at home, locked doors and lit streets not far away. I remind myself that I survived, that I got away, that the entity is confined to those mountains, or at least I hope it is. Occasionally, I consider that maybe we stirred it up, that by seeing it and confronting it, we fed its power in some intangible way. But that's too horrifying to dwell on for long, so I carry on with my life, trying to keep that terror in a sealed vault at the back of my mind. The five of us still cross paths from time to time, though it's never quite the same. We avoid the topic of that trip unless someone brings it up as a warning to others about going too deep into unfamiliar woods. Even then, we speak in vague terms, leaving out the details of the creature's appearance and the creeping sense that it was not just a ghost or an animal, but something far more sinister. It hurts too much to recall the fear we felt, the primal panic that flooded our senses. For me, the worst part was the knowledge that we were so woefully unprepared. All our technology, GPS, compass, flashlights, failed us when we needed them most. That's how the forest reminded us that we were outsiders, transient figures in a realm that belonged to something else. Sometimes I dream about going back, not out of bravery, but out of a strange desire for resolution. In these dreams, I walk alone through the dense thicket, the old foundation covered in thicker moss than before, the wind whispering in those familiar, eerie tones. I see footprints in the mud again, elongated and inhuman. The temperature drops and I sense movement behind the trees, but in my dreams, I don't run. I stand there, trembling, waiting for the thing to show itself. Just as it steps into view, my alarm rings, or I bolt awake in a cold sweat. In the aftermath of such dreams, I always feel a mixture of relief and regret, as if a part of me wants to hear the land's full story, no matter how terrifying. But I know that's foolish. Whatever we encountered isn't interested in conversation or closure. It thrives on fear, on the centuries of pain saturating the soil. It wears rags of different eras, bits of twisted identity that reflect the countless tragedies that have stained those mountains. And if it speaks, it's only through echoes and mimicry, the laughter of children lost to time, the moans of soldiers who died without proper burial, the gasps of men and women accused of witchcraft. It's all in there, swirling around in that malevolent presence. Confronting it again wouldn't give me peace. It would only tear open old wounds. I've resigned myself to living with the memories, acknowledging them like scars. In quiet moments, I recall how the five of us stumbled out of that forest, eyes darting everywhere, hearts racing. I remember the relief of seeing our cars, the surreal banality of turning the ignition keys, hearing the engine's familiar rumble. That feeling of relief was so overwhelming it was almost painful. And then the slow realization that we had taken something with us, in our minds, if not physically. A story, an encounter, a glimpse of the inexplicable darkness that dwells in certain corners of the world. I don't share the story often. When I do, I tend to gloss over the details, offer plausible alternatives. But if someone were to look into my eyes at that moment, they'd see the undisguised terror that no rational explanation can erase. And if they asked me, "Do you really believe something inhuman was there?" I'd have no choice but to say yes, because I can't deny what I saw and felt. It wasn't just fear, it was a visceral knowledge that some evils are as old as the stones beneath our feet, older than any history we record in books. So life moves on. I go to work, pay my bills, meet friends for coffee. But on nights when the wind howls outside my window, I sometimes sit up in bed, feeling a tug of dread. I recall the swirl of wind around our campsite, the shape perched on that boulder, the laughter that should not have been there. And I remember that fear is not just a fleeting emotion. It's a haunting, a ghost of its own that follows you home. That's the story of our time in those Virginia mountains, a story that left us all changed. If there's a moral, Perhaps it's that some places are not meant to be disturbed. Perhaps we learned that the land, with all its hidden wounds and dark legacies, can manifest nightmares we can't begin to fathom. And sometimes, the best any of us can do is acknowledge its power and keep our distance, praying we never again catch those gleaming eyes in our flashlight's beam.